Hello and welcome to episode 3 in this Azure Data Factory Zero to Hero series. Now, previously, we've actually covered what Azure Data Factory is, why we should learn it. In the second episode, we went over some of the dependencies and actually creating an Azure account, obviously pivotal. And now we're at the stage where we've just got to go over the last of the prerequisites. But in this episode as well, we'll be looking at some of the technical elements. We'll be creating our first pipeline. So we'll be looking at creating an Azure Data Factory, creating some Azure file storage, and then lastly, actually using the copy data tool, the wizard, to create our first simple pipeline that doesn't actually take much, but will introduce you to sort of the magic of Azure Data Factory. So stick around for that. I'm going to explain this. It's a slightly longer episode than today, but I wanted to not only just go over some of the dependencies, I want to start to do this, but introduce it in a practical manner so that things start to make sense and we get into the more exciting technical elements of Azure Data Factory. So we're back in the Azure portal. Like we've been previously, this is obviously the home of our Azure services, and this is where we'll go to create our Azure storage account, our data factory, resource groups, and so on. So, first thing that we actually want to do, because we're going to be thinking about starting to build ETL workflows or pipelines, we want to create an Azure storage account. Now, this is just a really handy way to store some of our data that we know we'll use in the cloud that maybe we don't rely on a schema for, so such as SQL. It can be a blob or it can be a bit more free flow, and we don't necessarily have to worry about that. So, for our example today, that's perfect. Now, it's going to make a lot more sense as we go through why it's important to set up all these dependencies. But I'm going to show you in a very basic way how to go through and create a storage account. So the first thing, we need our subscription. That's fine because we've already created our Azure account. That will be present. You can just select it, and I'm going to create a new resource group. So remember, this is just a way to sort of bundle up our resources in a way that makes sense. So we may be doing analytics types things here or data engineering, whatever. I'll just call it analytics so that we know that's a resource group where we're essentially grouping together resources that work in a similar fashion. Now, region, choose it as close in proximity to you. So I'll choose UK West. That's quite important. If there's ever anything like restores, backups and so on, that proximity is actually quite important. So just get it as close to you as you can see an option for. Now, the rest of these things I'm just actually going to breeze through. There's definitely some considerations in more advanced situations. You can go back retrospectively and edit some of these settings, but we're essentially not even checking any boxes here. I'm just showing you the scope, even things like data protection and encryption. So that's a nice to know, but for what we're doing, it's not actually incredibly important. So once we're happy with this, we can just go ahead and actually create our Azure storage account, and that will just do the usual. It will deploy, may take up to a few minutes, may not, but usually, some of these things are deployed within about a minute for us to use. So while that deployment is in progress, we can navigate back to the Azure portal, and you can see we get a notification that the deployment has succeeded. Um, so we can actually explore and just validate that this has been created. So when you click in storage accounts in the sort of more popular resources there, you've got the shortcut. You can just click, you can see you've got a new storage account created, and you can click there to see um, inside that file storage account. Now, there's lots of details here, lots of metadata, but what we actually want to do is just create a container um, to house the data that we'll be working with later on in our pipeline. And you could have containers full of different data that you regularly use and want to move around or perform um, transformations on. So I don't need to search a container because I have nothing there. I can create a container, and I'm just going to name this CSV files container. Now you notice quite often I like to name things with Pascal case, so capitalize each letter and join the words. However, you'll notice certain times there's specific naming conventions here. We could use hyphens or lowercase, so just something to keep an eye on if you are getting errors. So now we have that container where we want to house our CSV files. Um, I believe actually in this case I'm going to throw in an XLSX, but that's sort of besides the point. Yeah, I select a local file from my system. I'm just actually depositing in an Excel, but we're going to transform this to a CSV. Um, anyway, so that's fine. That just shows how simple it is to upload blob storage. As I say, if you're not concerned about schemas, mapping into like SQL databases, blob storage is very good to just sort of dump some of your files. Now, the next thing we need to do, we can click on data factories and we just need to create a data factory because we have nothing there either. And that's obviously essential to working within Azure Data Factory. So we're going down the hierarchy. Now we're going to see why some of these prerequisites we set up are important. So in the subscription, naturally, again, just our standard Azure subscription should only be one option there. And in the resource group, we can then choose analytics. We don't need to create a new one. So these prerequisites are starting to make sense, and it can be quite a bit overwhelming if you're going through all these, you're creating all these different elements, different dependencies. So setting some of these up in advance is definitely helpful. Now, for the instance, I'm just going to name this after our Zero to Hero series. You can call it whatever you like. It's just the instance of Data Factory. It's just the name of the Data Factory, essentially. The region, again, as close to you in proximity. And I'm going to skip through the advanced settings. I'm just going to create our standard Data Factory. Again, that will deploy. It may take a few minutes, but we will soon have a fully functioning Data Factory, as you can see. So if we go back to the Azure portal, and you can see because we perform some actions in our file storage, it's sprung into our favorites and resources. So now I'm going to look into my data factory. Because we're using a web UI as well, I quite often like to refresh. You may notice that just to check everything's okay. Now, we can actually, within our data factory, we can launch Studio, which is what we want to do to actually start to build ETL workflows, pipelines, any activities. That's going to be done in this Studio. So you'll see a warning or a pop-up for setting up a code repository. That's a very good idea. We'll look at that down the line. For now, it's not within the remit of this tutorial. So you have the home screen, and where the pen is, the author tab, we'll use that a lot, but we'll go into that further down the line. Right now, what we're going to do is just create a copy data pipeline. Now, in order to do that, we can go to the ingest card here, and that will set up the copy data wizard. Again, this is just because copying data from one place to another is such a common task. And you may have opportunities to flatten this or change this somehow. But if you just want a quick movement of data, this is a really popular tool. So there's actually a built-in wizard. We will look at much more complex pipelines and ETL workflows later on, but this is just a nice introduction. So we specify a source type. Now for us, that would be our Azure Blob Storage because we had that production inventory file based on AdventureWorks dataset, and we're going to move that to another container within our Azure storage. So the connection, we're actually going to create a new connection here for the blob storage. Now, this is just a way for us to interact with our existing Azure file storage. And as you can see, this is why it's important. Sometimes we can build some of the dependencies on the fly. Sometimes they're better to already be established. So just a few items to select as we've done before. And from there, we can go ahead and actually create our source data. So, well, we can create the directions for that. Now we just select a file. Again, the handy thing about setting this up in advance, you can see I have a copied data container I created. Just to send this data over to, you can do that in your file storage. But in our CSV file containers, which we set up together previously, that has my file in it. You can add any file to this that you like. And that's how easy it is to retrieve the data and start ingesting it and then sending it over in our pipeline. So the other options in the wizard are pretty much set up for you. Recursively is fine. And a lot of these things may come in handy down the line, but for what we're looking at right now, but last modified, that's not going to really be a concern to us. But it would be if you're looking to restrict the flow of data later on. We're also just executing this once. You could set this up in a trigger or a schedule. So sheet name, sheet one is just what it inherited from Excel. It could be anything for yourself. The range could be helpful again for what we're doing, just demonstrating the movement of data within the simple wizard. It's not important. Destination data store is, we're going to choose blob storage. You could have something like a SQL database. You could have different syncs or sort of destination data stores. But for us, blob storage is fine. And we're going to use the connection string that we've previously set up. And then we can actually direct this to that empty copied data folder. We could specify a file name if we want. We're not going to in this instance. And you can look at some of the copy behavior. So you do have options to flatten hierarchies and things. Obviously, that would be prevalent in certain data file types. So, things like JSON, that may be important. So here we're happy to send this over in delimited text, a sort of standard comma separated format. And then, yeah, there are some advanced settings that we're not going to look into for now, but feel free to play around with this. But we will, for more complex operations, we'll go through this in the series and build more bespoke pipelines and ETL flows with the data flow. Now, this is going to get saved into our um, main Azure Data Factory, the authoring tab that I spoke about. So we can specify a name. We will just say copy pipeline demo, just for reference later on. And then we don't really need to select anything here. We can see this supplies a summary, and that's all it takes to set up a simple pipeline movement of our data, just copying that over. So when we click next, this is actually going to perform for us. It's a nice GUI, especially in the web. And when we click finish, that has already taken place. We didn't go through the standard debugging process or the validation, but we can finish up here and we can actually navigate and make sure that everything we expected to happen has happened. So I spoke about the author tab here. So we can see we have the number 1 against pipeline. So we have that pipeline with the name that we specified set up. And just the source data set and the destination when we move it over has actually been saved as well. So we could go ahead and rename these if we want to be more specific or remember these later on. And then the only thing that we need to remember to do is actually to go ahead and publish these so they're saved into our Azure Data Factory permanently, so that we can be secure in that knowledge. Now, that looks okay. So we could go ahead and you can see the great thing about Data Factory, sometimes a hindrance. There's always a lot of notifications, but they are a good reminder. And I do like how well laid out and how polished the UI looks, especially given that it's done in our browser, usually Chrome or Edge. So from there, we could actually navigate back to the Azure portal if we like, and we're going to be able to um, go into our Azure file storage and just make sure that everything actually has moved as planned. So you'll see that if we navigate into that copied data, we have a recent movement of our production inventory file there. So that looks great. That's coming as the text with the comma separated as we specified. We do have some more options here. If we want to download it, view some versions, delete, and so on. But that's exactly what we anticipated to happen. So that's perfect. Um, and yeah, from there, we later on we can go into our authoring and we will look at more complex examples. But stick around for the next episodes where we'll look into more technical and bespoke elements. But yeah, everything's here. Everything looks great. And you've had your first flavor into actually performing some movement of data, which really in any data role is absolutely critical. So as usual, if you like the content, please feel free to like, comment, subscribe, and share. And I look forward to seeing you in episode 4. Thank you.